So you've probably heard the term no self referred to, often in non-duality teachings or awakening teachings, Buddhist teachings, and it's spoken about quite a lot online. A lot of people that I speak to seem to be exploring no self and are often confused by this, and that's for good reason, because as a concept, for the mind, for the one who wants to understand it, it's pretty inconceivable, really. And also you could say the current atmosphere, ground where we're exploring awakening through videos, there's a lot of misconception about the teachings on, I would say not no self, but not self, or what is often referred to as the not self characteristic of conditions. So you can probably feel into how that term, the not self characteristic in conditions, is very different to saying there is no self. However, what we often get is people saying quite, like with a lot of confidence, there is no self. Now, I'm not here to dispute whether that's true or not, but you can see how that kind of teaching, that kind of message has a different impact. If we're really deeply self-identified, or we've been ourselves for a very long time, which we all have been, to hear someone say, no, that's not true, there is no self, you're not you, that can be a really challenging thing, and actually it can be really quite upsetting sometimes. So there's a reason why in a lot of traditions the not self teachings, or I would, to use the Pali term, you could say the Anatta or Anatta-Lakkhana teachings, they're explored much later on somebody's journey, on somebody's path, on the path to awakening, the path to realization. They're often a lot later because actually when communicated very early on, when we're still just trying to find our footing, they can result in a nihilistic outlook. And I've seen this very recently with a number of people, they become attached to this idea that there is no self. So they don't explore the not self characteristic in conditions, and I'll explain a bit what that is shortly. But they get attached to the idea that there is no self. And that can result in a lot of self-destructive tendencies and nihilistic views on the world. If there's not a really strong foundation of mindfulness, acceptance, loving kindness already in our experience, when we hear teachings like there is no self, that can be really problematic. The reactive mechanism gets sparked up, and a lot of things can fight against that. So I guess I'm trying to say that at the moment, the way that no self is being communicated, it can be troublesome. It's problematic for a lot of people. And there's a few reasons why. I've kind of pointed to it at the beginning with the different terminology. One of the reasons is we have a lot of non-duality and Advaita teachers, which are not necessarily deeply rooted in historical Advaita, historical non-dualism. They don't have to be, but because of that, they've got a modern experiential understanding of what non-dual realization is. And that's beautiful. But traditionally, anatta, anatman, not self, it's not part of those teachings. It just isn't there. In fact, it's kind of the limit to which those teachings go. The highest truth is communicated by more traditional teachers. Let's say Rupert Spear is a great example. He communicates very clearly in his non-dual teachings that I am, so the divine self, is the highest truth. Now that's very different, isn't it, to there is no self. So when you've got this tradition that really rests on a divine self, a self with a capital S, the self kind of divine self-manifestation of the Godhead, to then, within that framework, put forward that there is no self, well, that can be confusing. That's problematic. Okay. And then one of the other reasons why it can be complicated is because of the very term no self. I mean, it's just kind of made up, really, no self. It's kind of a modern interpretation of what the not self teachings are. So the very first, or one of the very first teachings given by the Buddha after his enlightenment, upon his awakening, was to a group of close friends that he'd been practicing with for many years. So these friends were deep practitioners. They'd been going at this for a long time, and they'd already been exploring deep states of concentrated meditation. So definitely not beginners. You know, they're people that have really explored states of consciousness, their own being. So when he did communicate to them in his second sutta, it's called the Anatta-Lakkhana Sutta. It's a great name. I really love Anatta-Lakkhana. But the Buddha teaches for the very first time a reflection on the not self characteristic in conditions. And what he's basically saying, and if you can read this yourself, it's a very, very beautiful and very direct pointing to the misidentification of what we are and why we suffer because of that. So what he's saying is, listen, there's these skandhas, these heaps of conditions. So I'll see if I can remember these. So forms, feelings, perceptions, mental objects, and consciousness. So these piles of experiential phenomena that we take ourselves to be, there is no self to be found in those. Or rather, what he says is that these conditions are not self. These conditional formations that come and go, they are not self. And that's kind of the core of that teaching. One of his very first teachings. And you could say the very first teachings maybe of Anatta in the world. But it's worth noting, he doesn't go to his friends and say, his deep practitioner friends that he'd been practicing with for years, and say, there is no self, you and you never existed. He doesn't say that. He says, investigate conditional reality, conditional life. Investigate what you take yourself to be. Notice that it arises and ceases, and these conditions are not self. And upon seeing that, you can reflect on the passing conditions. So on clearly seeing the arising, the apparent abiding, and the ceasing of form, for instance. So in this case, it would be the form of the camera that I'm looking at, you know. Upon the arising, abiding, and ceasing of that, I can recognize that these conditions are not me. They are not mine. I am not this. I am not this passing flow of conditions. So it's a reflective practice. It's not a denial of anything. It's not a philosophical statement either that there is no self. It's to reflect on the nature of conditions and notice these conditions are not self. Now, what he's not saying is that there's no such thing as the person that exists. There's no such thing as this individuated experience. He doesn't say that. He never says that. But what he does say is that it cannot be explored, understood, identified through dualistic concepts. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because if we stick really, really strictly to this statement, there is no self, then that can cause a lot of confusion. And also, it's not very helpful, really. It doesn't really help us to explore what is here when we're not attaching to conditions. And that's what this exploration of awakening is to recognize the conditional nature of phenomena, the things we usually take ourselves to be, the forms, feelings, thoughts, choices, consciousness, these things that arise and cease, that are compounded. We usually identify with those and say, that's what I am. But on reflection that these conditions are not self, there's a letting go. And with that letting go, we get to see our true nature, the nature of what is unconditioned. And that's very, very different from saying, there is no self, I am not self. It's really exploring what we truly are. And what we truly are, well, it can't be defined. As the Buddha said, he very rarely says anything about his experience as an awakened being. He points people to it, but he very rarely says anything about it. But in one of the suttas, the Vacchagotta Sutta, he says to Vacchagotta, a guy who's asking him loads of questions, at one point he says, the Tathagata is boundless, unfathomable, vast like the great ocean. So not definable by self or no self, beyond any kind of framework or terminology we can use through the dualistic mind to apply definition. So the Tathagata, which the Tathagata is the name that the Buddha gave himself, the one that has gone forth, really, the one that has left conditioned existence behind. But he's saying that, listen, I'm not what you take me to be. I'm also not what you don't take me to be. So the Tathagata is beyond that, is unfathomable, unbound, vast like the great ocean. So if you're feeling confused by no self, that's understandable. What I would say is, maybe don't worry about it too much, because it can get us all in such a spin. And also, actually, the not self teachings, offered to explore, they're really quite advanced practices. And we really need to build foundations of stillness, clarity, acceptance, loving kindness, in order for us to deal with and explore and open to that which is there when we're not attaching to things. I hope this is helpful. I have another video on no self which is a bit more straightforward, and I'll post that in the comments, also in the description below. It's worth a watch. It's just me basically kind of going on like this, but a bit simpler, and just trying to clarify a little bit this confusion that I see again and again, which is often quite harmful.